Hi, everyone. Welcome to a very special live event by Mother Jones. Today, we're going to be talking all about the restaurant industry. I am your host. I'm Maddie Oatman, and I'm a senior editor at Mother Jones. I have an incredible group of panelists with me today. You'll be hearing from them soon. We're going to talk about how the pandemic has laid bare inequalities in the restaurant industry, and also how some restaurants are experimenting with new models to spark social change. I think it's pretty clear that the pandemic has transformed our relationship to restaurants. Some of you out there are maybe missing your favorite neighborhood cafe, or maybe you're excited about a new Instagram pop-up from a favorite chef. I will never forget my last indoor meal before the lockdown. I was in this very crowded pizzeria, and we had just started hearing about COVID. So the thing on everyone's mind at the beginning was surface contamination, and everyone was making sure to wash their hands over and over again. And it's just kind of wild looking back and thinking we weren't really worried about the air we were sharing. It's just surreal how much we've gone through in the last year. And we know so much more now. But in the meantime, restaurants have really been pushed to their breaking point. Workers have struggled, maybe, a ton in this industry, maybe more than many others. And I think even the idea of the role of a restaurant in the community has changed. So if you have a burning question about where restaurants go from here, or a comment, you can always ask in the comments section of whatever platform you're watching this on. So maybe Facebook, Twitter. Go ahead and pop in a question. Joining me to talk about all of this and more, I have three amazing panelists. First up, Reem Assil is an award-winning Palestinian Syrian chef based in Oakland. She's the owner of Reem's California and Reem's California Mission in San Francisco. And both of them are inspired by Arab street corner bakeries. Before becoming a chef, Reem spent over a decade as a community and labor organizer, and she has twice been a semi-finalist for the James Beard Best Chef of the West Award. Hi, Reem.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to be here with you all. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So next up, we have Tunde Way. He is a Nigerian-born chef, entrepreneur, activist, and writer for publications including the San Francisco Chronicle and Oxford American. He has launched several food businesses that demand us to think deeply about our privilege. For a food stall pop-up, he charged patrons different prices depending on their race. Hi, Tunde. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, last but not least, as the president of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at Berkeley, Saru Jayaraman has spent the last 20 years advocating for raising wages and working conditions for restaurant and other service workers. She is the author of several books, and she was recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. Hi, Saru. Welcome.
Hey, sorry, you caught me drinking water.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining me. So I talked a little bit about an experience I had that was kind of a quintessential pandemic experience in a restaurant. And I'm wondering if you were to pick a moment or a memory that symbolized like how the landscape had completely shifted, what comes to mind? And Reem, like you've actually been running a restaurant during this time. So I'm curious if you have a memory of the past year that kind of sums it up.
Well, it's pretty vivid for us because we had the good fortune or misfortune, however you want to see it, of actually opening a restaurant 3 days before the lockdown in
Wow.
California. And so sort of in the weeks leading up to that, anyone who's ever opened a restaurant knows you're like just tunnel vision, knee deep in the thick of it, not really sort of paying attention to anything out there in the world. And so we had sort of our soft opening in that week before. And I just have this like vivid memory of how many people were like packed in our mission location and how miserable we were. It was like we couldn't get the food out enough, and like everybody was watching us, and we were like in this bowl. You know, we were just like, oh my God, we can't do this. We need to like or figures by reporters who were asking us, what does it feel like to open in the middle of a pandemic? And yeah, I just have this vivid memory of like us sitting in the basement of our restaurant being like, okay, what are we gonna do? And kind of trying to create like a contingency plan for both of our locations. And then like literally as we were coming up from that meeting, the governor announcing the shutdown. So yeah, it was a very surreal moment for us. Yeah.
Just things changing so dramatically, like moment to moment, it sounds
We were
like.
we were actually gonna have a meeting with our staff about how we're gonna like relook at how to like slow things down. And then that meeting had to drastically change to like, we have to shut it down. So it was like a lot of thinking on our feet in the course of hours, you know.
As much as I think there's been a lot of nostalgia for the way things were before this pandemic, all three of you have been pretty vocal for a while about a lot of the problems inherent in how restaurants are structured and how people are treated in the restaurant industry, kind of just how the system is broken. So for one thing, American restaurant culture is unique in the way that we rely on tipping. We've totally normalized it. And it's really one of the only industries where people are expected to make up part of their regular wages in tips. So Saru, can you talk about some of the problems and perhaps unintended consequences of that system?
Yeah. Well, I think it's so important to understand first where that system comes from, because it was not an accident. It wasn't unintentional. It was incredibly planned and intentional. You know, before 1850 in the United States, before 1853, waiters in the US were mostly men, and they got a full wage. In Boston, in Philly, in New York, in Chicago, in major cities at that time, 1850, California was not as developed. Waiters were men. They got a full wage. And in 1853, they went on strike for higher wages. And the restaurant industry sought to replace these men because they were becoming too problematic. So they started replacing them with women. And then when emancipation of slavery happened in 1865, that a brilliant idea occurred to them, which is that they could hire Black people and essentially continue slavery by not paying them anything and have them live entirely on tips. So what people have to understand is that we have a $2.13 wage in the United States of America, and it hasn't gone up from 0 to $2.13. No, it has gone down from a full wage when white men worked as waiters down to a $2, first $0 wage and $2 wage as women and people of color have entered the industry. So the subminimum wage for tipped workers in the United States cannot be understood as anything other than a devaluation of Black lives and a devaluation of women's work. That is what it is. If you go down from a full wage to a $0 wage, you are saying that women and people of color are valued by this country at zero, which is no surprise. That's what it has been for way too long. So we started with a $0 wage at emancipation. That became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage for the first time, but millions of Black workers were left out. Farm workers who were mostly Black, domestic workers who were mostly Black, and tipped restaurant workers who were mostly Black were given a $0 wage and told, go get your income in tips, which was a mutation of the notion of tipping. Tipping started in Europe as an extra or bonus on top of the wage. The US changed tipping into a replacement for wages because of our ugly, ugly racial caste history. And we went from $0 wage in 1938 as part of the New Deal up to the incredible $2.13 an hour today. And today we have 43 states that persist with this legacy of slavery. I mean, Louisiana is a $2.13 wage, as is New Mexico, as is many other states in the US. 40 states actually have wages of $5 or less. And today, this has become the nation's largest and fastest growing industry. We were 14 million workers prior to the pandemic. 70% of tipped workers are women, mostly working in casual restaurants. So prior to the pandemic, you had one of the nation's largest workforces being allowed to be paid this literal legacy of slavery wage and facing the highest rates of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry in the US. And the persistence of racial inequality because of that sub-minimum wage, because it's now irrefutable. There's irrefutable evidence that there's customer bias in tipping. There's irrefutable evidence that people of color, and particularly women of color, are segregated into more casual restaurants where they earn less in tips. All of that has resulted in that devaluation, that original sin of devaluing people of color and women, having the wage go down to zero. It's a continuing sin. It's a continuing sin to force the nation's largest workforce to live off this incredibly biased system.
Tunde, I'm wondering, basically early in the pandemic, this debate emerged about whether the federal government should bail out the restaurant industry, the way it has bailed out airlines in the past. And my colleague Kara Vogt has written about this, has been covering this debate. So check out her stories on it. But Tunde, you self-published an essay pushing back against the bailout, and you called it "Let It Die." And I feel like, tipping is one part of, the industry's problem. And you kind of sketched out a few more. I'm wondering, why wouldn't we want the government to step in and save restaurants?
I think what was happening is that the government was bailing out restaurant owners and not necessarily restaurants. And the government was putting the onus on the restaurant owners to then distribute the monies to the employees. So I guess if I was to put a final point on that essay, that would be it. So I think whatever money the government has belongs to, well, first of all, the money is fake. It's created out of oblivion and force. But if there is going to be money, then the money should be redistributed. So I do believe in that. I just don't necessarily believe that the owners should decide how it's spent. And I actually don't think it's an efficient way of redistribution.
We've talked about, some of the kind of problems inherent in the industry. And I'm curious, how the pandemic, revealed some of the cracks in the foundation, or should have made them clearer to us if we've been paying attention. Reem, maybe you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's funny. Sort of leading up to the pandemic, I knew that sort of restaurants, the way they were they're just by design not made to support communities of color and workers. It's by design. So you can't fix something that by design is not actually intended to benefit the sum and the collective, especially in this country. I think that, in other countries, they've been able to sort of reimagine models, but I think the sort of neoliberal policies that people have, the privatization of everything, the government bailing out, like Tunde said, really the very few to decide that redistribution of wealth. And for me, actually, I sit on that totem pole in a weird way as the small business owner. And we're all sitting there fighting for crumbs and being pitted against our employees when we actually are harmed just in the same ways, right? And so I was kind of the same way. I was like, great, this all has to burn down. I was actually relieved in some ways, like we don't have to be on this rat race again. We can kind of like start from ground zero again and rebuild this in a different way. And people are ready to listen. I think this, like the stark moment that I had, like the moment for me as a business owner that I had that was sort of just sort of changed the course of Reem's was when, my employees wrote me a letter that was like, what is going to be our fate? And I didn't have a single answer for them, and that was just like a moment of transparency of like, yeah, I don't have the answers. I think that there's this sort of misconception, especially in the restaurant industry, with those, who are particularly perceived as in positions of power, happen to be white, straight, male, like know all the answers. And I didn't, and so I think we have been on this journey to figure out what those answers are together. So I think one of the cracks in the system really is sort of putting the power and the onus on people with perceived power to make all the decisions on the behalf of the many. And we need to break that. And for me, I'm like, everybody's like, how do we save this, or how do we even fix this industry or build it from the ground up? And I'm like, I want to know just as much as you, but we need to involve the people who've been most hurt by it and who've built it up and figuring out the solution. They're going to know the solution to the problem because they've been the most impacted, and they're not going to be involved in helping with that solution unless they have a stake in it, right? Unless they see a future for themselves where they can live their lives in dignity, where they can make a living for their families, where they can take care of their communities. Like there's nothing in it for them to be at the center of that table unless we actually really equip them with the tools and the power to actually help make those decisions. So that was like a real stark moment for me, is like, I didn't want to tokenize, my employees. I wanted to sort of level the playing field, like democratize our knowledge and our lack of knowledge and figure it out together. And I think more restaurants have to be doing this. Like, I feel like all of the writing that came out in the beginning of like, how are we going to save the restaurant industry, was just like asking all the owners. And they were like almost tokenizing their employees, like our workers, like it just, they felt like characters in a book that were like a second thought. And it was very like, I don't know, paternalistic. And I'm like, we're just going to repeat the same system that way. And so I'm just trying to break that a little bit. And it requires me to be vulnerable, and it requires me to have the right community partners. So yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the answer to your question, but I do think that there's like a psyche of who is sitting at the center and making these decisions that impact their lives. And we're missing that key component, which is primarily BIPOC communities who make up the majority of this industry. And if we can get that part right, that has like ripple effects, because the restaurant industry is part of a food system that is like also plagued with inequity, and that's part of a larger system. So if we can get that part right, I think that there could be ripple effects on all the industries that are peripheral to restaurants, right? So
Saru, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I definitely want to jump in on that question. I so appreciate what both Reem and Tunde are saying. If only all employers were like them. I mean, when you asked that first question of like, think of a moment, that what was one of the most impactful moments? I mean, the moment that always comes back, we started a relief fund for restaurant workers in this industry. About 250,000, 250,000 workers applied to us for relief. And that is that is a small percentage. Overall, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 60% of the 250,000 that applied told us that they couldn't get unemployment insurance because in most states they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. So it boils my blood to hear restaurant owners say now, especially the large chains, oh, we can't find workers because they're lazy sitting at home getting unemployment insurance. 60% of 6 million workers couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. So that resulted in, I don't think people understand, because so many of us have been at home on Zoom, or I don't think people understand the level and scale of destitution. I mean, and you asked me for a moment. The moment I remembered was just reading thousands of comments from these workers who applied. I can't feed my children. I don't have gas to get to the food bank, money for gas to get to the food bank. One woman said, I go to the food bank and all I get is bread and syrup. How am I going to feed my son? I am having to steal food for my children. It is, these are restaurant workers who work 1, 2, 3 jobs. The day things were shut down, zero savings. They were living, as I like to call it, tip to mouth. They got tips when they go in and they come home, they feed their kids, it's gone. So the level of destitution was insane. Last summer, when workers started to go back to work and we asked them their conditions, 70% of the workers said, we're being asked to do so much more for so much less. Tips are down 50 to 75%, according to the majority of workers, because sales are down. And they said the hostility from customers has shot through the roof. The health risks are way high. We're being asked to enforce social distancing and mask rules on the same customers from whom we're supposed to get tips to make up our wages. And worst of all, 50% of women and 40% of all workers said sexual harassment went way up during the pandemic. Now, mind you, we already had the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the US because we force a mostly female population of tipped workers to rely on inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. And that went way up, and thousands of women wrote into us saying that on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a shift, male customers ask them to take off their masks so they can judge their looks and their tips on that basis. We heard this so frequently from so many women, we ended up calling it masculine harassment. And the comments the women submitted, the guy says, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are, so I can decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much I want to tip. Or take off your mask so I can stick my tongue down your throat. Which means that this whole system that we've just described as dysfunctional, racist, sexist, unjust, went from being all of those things and now also life-threatening. Paying somebody a $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 wage so that she has no choice but to take off her mask because she needs desperately the tip from the guy who's asking her to take off her mask, is asking her to put her life at risk. It is threatening her life to get her tip, to get an income, for a chance to get her income. And I am sorry, there's no other essential worker group, and these are essential workers. There's no other essential worker group that's not paid a minimum wage and that is being asked to take off their protective gear for a chance to earn their income. It is insane. And these are the same workers we're now going to say to them, we'll raise everybody else's wages, but we'll leave you behind so that you can go ahead and continue to struggle with being told, take off your mask or do as I say for the chance to get a tip. It's unconscionable.
Yeah, that's really outrageous. I wonder, after you were getting this feedback about this dramatic increase in sexual harassment during the pandemic, did you find that certain things would make a difference, or would that help, change,
Absolutely.
kind of start to address that problem?
Absolutely. Reem and I are in California. California requires a full minimum wage of $15 with tips on top, or we're getting there. And nobody gets paid a sub-minimum wage. And the data shows that California, which is one of 7 states, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, require a full minimum wage with tips on top, have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment as the 43 states with the sub-minimum wage. Why? Because sexual harassment hasn't gone away in California. That's not what I'm saying. Even a 50% rate is still higher than almost every other industry. But cutting it so dramatically is because when you pay people a full livable wage, they can count on that wage from their boss. They're not entirely dependent on the tip to feed their family. If you get a $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 wage, even a $7 wage, I can tell you that wage goes almost entirely to taxes. You are living off your tips. And when you live off your tips, you have to put up with whatever the customer does to you. If they're racist and you're a person of color, you're SOL. If you're a woman and they want to touch you, that's kind of what you got to do. We did a server for an hour event with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a few years ago. And she was saying, as a bartender, maybe at the beginning of the month, she worked in New York, which is a sub-minimum wage state. Maybe at the beginning of the month, if a guy tries to grab you, you could say buzz off. By the 15th of the month to the end of the month, when they try to grab you, you have to let them, because that's how you're going to pay your rent the first of the next month. You have no other income. And so you're living off your tips and you have to put up with it. If you live in a state that requires your employer to pay you a full minimum wage, you can say buzz off. You still get tips, but you're not entirely dependent. That power dynamic is what got so much worse during the pandemic. The power dynamic between the women, particularly women of color servers, and male customers got so much worse during the pandemic.
I want to share, I think, if I may, even here in California, when it's just really, the cost of living is just through the roof. And, yes, we have sort of a living wage or a minimum wage, so to speak. But I think typically what I have seen is that employers sort of still use tips to subsidize wages, right? And I guess my question that I just always sort of throw out is what onus also is it on the people running these restaurants and managing these restaurants? Yes, there should be policy to help enforce that, but I do think there's this pervasive culture of using tips as a way to subsidize, kind of squeezing out the last, really thinking of workers as bodies and as expendable. And so kind of letting some of those things slide that are a little bit less sort of in your face around, workers. For us at Reem's, we don't do tips anymore. We got rid of that during COVID. We were it's no longer about the customer. It was never really about the customer, but we made it more explicit after COVID, just kind of seeing these crazy stories. But, that meant we had to figure out a way to be able to pay hazard pay and hardship pay because those tips weren't coming in. And I think that there is this pervasive culture, especially, sort of with higher wages, that they're still kind of subsidized by these tips. So anyways, just kind of a thought about where do the employers come in and where do they fit into the equation?
Yeah, it's been interesting. Even my grocery store started asking for tips during the pandemic. And I think people want to give money. They want to some extent help if they feel like the money is going to the workers that they're seeing. But it causes questions, I think, about why are we relying on this tip system? And yeah, what's going on with the larger power dynamic at play? Tunde, you mentioned just questioning how the distribution of wealth is working, and that redistribution of money wouldn't be fair if it didn't go to the workers. I'm curious kind of how you envision or how you would design a system where the wealth would flow to workers.
Wow, design a system. I guess the system already exists, right? So when the government was giving out the stimulus checks, it went directly to people. So I think that's one way that could happen. But just listening to Reem and Saru and just thinking about this, it's obvious to me that this is a political project. It's meaning that there's work to be done to educate all of us about what our roles are as maybe citizens rather than employees or employers, because there is not necessarily any virtue in being an employee just by virtue of your class position. And there's definitely no virtue in being, an employee with relative resources. So resources relative to your employer, but you're all both in a precarious situation. If you talk to restaurant owners, they feel, and it's real to them that they feel a desperation as well, and you can't tell them that their desperation isn't as real as the desperation of the employees. So in my mind, I think like part of the work that has to be done is like educating everybody about the kind of system that we want to have. But I think, yeah, we start first with redistributing resources, but then that has to work in concert with educating folks about the system. Because what I found was whatever gains have been made in this time, in this sort of like period where restaurants were trying to reconfigure, they were turning themselves into kitchens, or sorry, into community kitchens, or they were like, they were doing food drives and all these things. Like those gains weren't in service of a systems change. They were in service of like an adaptive change to what the system was evolving into. So folks weren't necessarily trying to be less capitalist or be more socialist or be less sexist or anything. They were responding to what was happening now and how eventually or even currently they could keep what they had. So if it was power, if it was money, if it was a job, if it was the opportunity to like to have leisure, they were just trying to keep what they have. And so there hasn't really been a change because there hasn't really been we haven't really addressed the like political condition that undergirds not just the restaurant system but like the entire economic system.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, I want to. This is going to sound weird, but I want to talk about Instagram, only because Tunde, you made a series of a couple of mini documentaries. I think they were on Instagram. Maybe you released them elsewhere, but you actually made a video where you were interviewing Reem. And one of the things she said that kind of relates to that is basically like, if we don't rebuild the systems right now in this vacuum, you're afraid, like I'm afraid of what will happen. And so Reem, you've kind of hinted at the ways that you're thinking about rebuilding the system with your workers. You're actually paying your workers to learn how to take over your business. So can you talk about how that's going to work?
Yeah. I think so. Reem's sort of, we had our 10-year vision back in like before the pandemic, and, worker ownership has always sort of been that was going to be the end goal. And then the pandemic really kind of sped things up. We're like, now is the time, right? Because this was, for us, I think what we saw, and there are ebbs and flows of this, but this was a really politicizing moment for a lot of our workers, particularly our undocumented workers, or like our folks who really stood to lose the most from what happened. It was particularly, I wouldn't go as far to say radicalizing, but potentially radicalizing moment. And for us, Reem's had never been sort of just about being a restaurant. I come from a labor organizing background, and one of the things I really appreciated about organizing is that you're giving workers tools to sort of advocate for themselves in their workplace, in a place that's really, it's life or death for some people, right? and the stakes are really high. But the byproduct of that is that you're giving them leadership to go out and lead in their own communities, you know? And so sort of thinking about this project, whether Reem's becomes worker owned or not, right? Could we use this moment to organize our own employees to be both leaders of Reem's and then to go out and be leaders in their communities on the issues that are impacting their lives, right? And could we use this tool as a model for other restaurants, as particularly restaurant owners that maybe felt like me, like, I don't want to have to deal with this on my own, right? Like, I feel so isolated. I feel so burdened. I want to, I want to feel like I'm really in community, to be able to show how that works. For me, it was really important that, just handing, I think, like, I really resonated with this. There's no virtue in being an employee or an employer or any of that thing out of context, right? That it's really important to, like, none of us are immune from the forces of white supremacy and capitalism. And so just like handing over something to workers is not in and of itself a virtuous thing. I think really equipping people with the tools to not replicate the systems that got us here in the first place, that is the more interesting thing to me. And so, at Reem's, I sort of stated my intention. I want to do this with you all. I think that, we need to build our resilience to have Reem's for the long haul. Let's do it together. Let's all have a stake in it together. Let's share the burden and let's share the successes, because no matter what, the food world, the way that they've sort of pinned it, it's all about the owner. And it's all about, like, I'm the one who's James Beard nominated, whether I like it or not, and I just didn't want that anymore, and I was, I wanted to kind of level that playing field. And so we launched a program called Samud, which in Arabic means steadfast resilience or steadfast perseverance. And it's really the idea to sort of build the building blocks for resilience for the next time to come. Like, the next time something like this comes, we're all equipped to figure it out together. And it's an apprenticeship program that basically we have 50% of our employees are in it, and they get paid to really participate in classes for twice every other week. And we have community partners that are involved in the One Fair Wage is involved, folks who are doing this work on the ground around racial equity, around language justice, around co-op movements, right? Like the worker cooperative movement. Everybody is sort of helping. So we harness this community support around our workers so that by the time we get to the point where I want to transition the business into the hands of the workers, they feel equipped and confident to create the bylaws that work for them, right? That work for all of us. So we're learning all of the hard skills and the soft skills, but we're also getting politicized. We're understanding these systems that got here in the first place so that when it comes time to collectively govern Reem's, we're not replicating the same systems. Because I want to tell you, and this is a moment of transparency and vulnerability, like, even as an organizer, I fell into owner, employer-employee dynamics, because that's the way this food system was created. And I just felt like I needed to get out of that silo, right? And so this is the way we're doing it. It's messy. It's very intentional. It takes time. A lot of hard conversations. Everybody is at different levels. It's multilingual. We have interpreters. We're trying to level the playing field as much as we can so that we can figure this all out together. And, in the meantime, my role is really to build between our workers at Reem's and community. I think that the role of restaurants we really have to think about that, sort of, how do we harness, because I do feel like restaurants sort of play that role of sort of being the conduit between the people who work in the establishment and in the neighborhoods that are surrounding them. And, because of gentrification and because of sort of the types of restaurants that have gotten funding and have popped up, that that continuity and that connection has been challenged in the last, 5-10 years. It's, why I hope that we redistribute to the wealth to the mom and pop shops who've survived generation after generation. This is not their first rodeo in dealing with these challenges. So yeah, I think that my role has now become that sort of conduit and that connector.
That's cool to just, be thinking about like rethinking even the roles people play running a restaurant. But so speaking of initiatives, Saru, with the High Roads Kitchen initiative, you're subsidizing restaurant owners who can make a pledge to pay a living wage to their workers and follow equitable employment practices. So just another way of kind of rethinking how restaurants might run themselves. Can you just talk about like what are examples of equitable employment practices? Like what do we mean there?
Yeah, and just to be clear, the High Road Kitchens was a program to try to model for the government how we thought relief should be happening. It was not, relief, relief has been happening, as Tunde mentioned, just this very kind of very overarching, broad set of gifts, essentially to restaurant owners, not very little to workers, and we were trying to model that we thought relief should be tied to working conditions, wages and working conditions. So we were providing relief grants to restaurants that were tied to paying a livable wage, one fair wage, no lesser wage for tipped workers, no matter where you were, going through our race and gender equity program, which asks restaurants to assess first the number of people of color and women in all of the different positions in a restaurant, and then to basically overhaul their hiring, recruitment, training, promotion, evaluation systems to be much more intentional about having people of color and women at the highest level positions that they want and that they seek. Desegregating your restaurant. Our industry is incredibly racially segregated. People of color, as I was mentioning earlier, are not only segregated into lower paying segments of the industry, fast food and casual restaurants, as opposed to fine dining, but even in fine dining, it's white people in the front, people of color in the back. Very much, again, another legacy of, I would say, plantation politics from the past. And so we actually help restaurants decolonize, desegregate their makeup. So these are some examples. Restaurants can overhaul their, as I said, hiring, recruitment, retention, promotion, evaluation systems, look at who's working in what position, change their wage structure, provide benefits, provide workers with some control over their schedules, or at least some knowledge of what their schedules are, because it's so often that workers have no idea when they're supposed to come in, or if they do, they get very little notice. So these are some equitable practices, but I do want to bring into the conversation, because we haven't named it yet. We've been talking about workers and small business owners, but we haven't named, to me, the protagonist of why the industry is as it is right now, which is the National Restaurant Association. The National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA, is the reason that we have a $2 wage. It's also the reason why the overall minimum wage in the US is $7.25. They have been the most powerful lobby in almost every state and in Congress, fighting to keep wages as low as possible for a very long time, fighting to not have to pay wages at all, fighting to be the only industry exempt from paying anybody wages at all. And then finally, they were forced to pay $2, which in my opinion is still a non-wage. So they have been around for a very long time. And when we talk about equitable practices and why the industry is as dysfunctional as it is, we do have to name the leaders of the industry who have set the standards that so many small businesses around the country simply follow and believe that there's just no other way. There's no other way to do it except to squeeze labor costs at a certain amount. There's no other way to do it except pay $2. If we were made to pay more, we'd all go out of business. These are fears that the Restaurant Association has perpetuated. And I just want to actually point out that 2 weeks ago, there was a huge expose in Newsweek that showed that in the same moment, the National Restaurant Association was telling Congress and telling small business owners in lots of states and telling everybody that there's no way they could pay a $15 minimum wage, that the industry would collapse, doom and gloom. In that same moment, the CFO of Denny's and the CFO of Cheesecake Factory were telling investors on analyst calls that, in fact, California had been the most successful state for their companies, paying 15 and a full minimum wage for tipped workers. They said because customer receipts were up, revenue was up because there was more spending. So they said what we've been saying all along: you pay this workforce more, actually the restaurant industry is going to do better, because if you have 14 million workers able to eat out, they will, and they'll spend it in this industry, and it will help small businesses especially, but it will help the whole industry. It clearly helped Denny's and Cheesecake Factory. So they're just lying. They are outright lying. They've been lying for 150 years. They're the ones who've set the standards around not just wages, but race, how we treat people of color, how we treat women. And we have to name that, because in this moment, and I'm sure Tunde and Reem can speak to this, restaurant owners, including these companies that lead the National Restaurant Association, the chains, are experiencing the worst labor shortage ever. They can't find workers, aren't coming back to work in this industry. We just did a survey of New York City workers. 40% say they're leaving the industry. And the number one reason they're leaving is they say the wages and tips are just too low and the health risks are too high. It doesn't add up anymore. It doesn't add up for me to take the risk to spend the money to get to work and then get so little as a wage. It's just not working anymore. The vast majority of workers said the number one reason that would make them come back to the industry or stay in the industry would be a livable wage. So the industry is killing itself. We can't reopen. We can't go back. You started the conversation with, we're all missing our Sunday brunches. Well, we can't go back to that unless we pay workers a livable wage, because they're not going to come back to this industry, and employers are not going to be able to find people to work, most of all.
Tunde, is this kind of, what you're hearing? Like, is the industry basically killing itself? Do you have any thoughts on?
Man, Saru is so compelling. You pay them a livable wage, please. Yeah, I think if I can add just a little bit to that, I think maybe, I'm not sure about the larger corporations, but the smaller, chef-owned restaurants, say, who are also under a lot of economic pressure. Separate out who the different kinds of employers are, to Saru's point. Like, they are huge corporations that are making lots of money. They also, smaller restaurants, the mom and pops, like Reem said, that have slim margins, but they're not afforded the economies of scale that the larger chains have. So what would it look like to begin to think about subsidizing those wages from those sorts of restaurants? I think that, again, because money is really a construct and it's mostly fake, but has some of the most damaging consequences, that the government can in fact afford to do this. The government gave out trillions in tax breaks to the rich during the last administration, and they're all these constant gifts, to large corporations, to uber wealthy folks. So maybe if I was to supplement what Saru has said so well, is to begin to think about government policy that directly compensates workers in the restaurant industry, but just across the board for their work.
Yeah,
We're
I just want to just add to that, like real estate is another big piece. Like if we could just treat our labor as a fixed cost, which we do at Reem's regardless, and we'll bite it, but the cost of banking, especially as a woman of color own business, like the interest rates, the really expensive real estate, all of these things are the things that sort of make us go under. And so if we just change sort of our thinking about where we need to subsidize or cut costs. But yeah, I do think like right now in this sort of K-shaped recovery, like all of these Dunkin' Donuts and Denny's, I'm sure they're buying up all sorts of real estate right now while it's cheap. I'm sure they're benefiting a lot. Like what could that look like actually for small businesses to actually own and not have to pay a landlord?
I just want to share. Go ahead.
I just real quick, just like the money is there. Like, there isn't, I'm not, money hasn't evaporated. It doesn't like disappear. There is money. It's just concentrated in lots of unsavory pockets. We need to just redistribute it.
I want to share two comments from readers. Carol says, this sparks joy. And Amalia says, this is so inspiring. Thank you. I feel like we're just starting and we could talk forever, but we're actually going to have to start to wrap up. So I want to hear, as we're beginning to think about what's next and, thinking about the future. Tunde, in the video that you did, in the documentary you did with Reem, you wondered, was it possible to be radical even as the system she was fighting against was a system she was benefiting from? And so I'm wondering if each of you could answer, how do we ensure that the change coming from within the industry does not repeat the same mistakes and mirror the same patterns as before? And how, how can we capitalize on the hunger for change without just kind of giving into, relief and excitement about reopening and just returning to the same patterns as before?
I'm sorry. My mom was calling me and that like messed up everything on my audio.
Oh, Tunde's mom.
So
Hi. That's okay. Basically,
I declined the call 3 times.
Sorry, Mom. Basically, I'm just kind of wondering, like, how do you ensure that the changes coming from within the industry do not repeat the same mistakes and patterns as before? Maybe Reem, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't know if I have the answer to that question. I think that, I always sort of thought that sort of my more radical work was on the outside, like Reem as the organizer outside of Reem, just trying to like provide for her family as the sole breadwinner in her family. And those two things got really merged during COVID. Like, I think that I grappled with that contradiction when Tunde asked me the really hard questions. I was like, easy for you to say, Tunde, you don't own a restaurant. And yet maybe he planted a seed. And I think that I'm still grappling with that contradiction. I think that I don't know if I could build my wealth off of owning a restaurant that's not extractive in the current model that it is. Like, I am grappling with that. And I don't have the answer to that question. But what I can do is try to sort of, Reems is like my baby. I want to grow the family and for everybody to take care of her with me. And, so that I can be the visionary and I can help grow her so that she'll be in a good place to give us all some sort of wealth. But me as a sole business owner, I don't think that, I just think that I can't make that change from the standpoint of being a business owner in the industry. That's, I guess, the short answer to the question. I do think that there are really amazing people doing some really cool things at the local level on the ground, and I've just touched the surface on learning about what those models are. So I think that it is possible to imagine a world different, that centers people, and that centers all of us being taken care of, where restaurants feed the community in more ways than one, and are not reliant on these market forces to survive. Like, there's just got to be a better way. And so right now we're trying to create the narrative and decolonize or unlearn some of the things that, maybe these forces like the government that says you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, or the NRA that's saying there can't be any other way. Like, all of these forces that are like bombarding us, it's like we're trying to like push out all that noise so that we can begin to reimagine there has to be a way. There was life before capitalism kind of came. So I'm inspired by that. I'm inspired by my workers. Like, just to like, as an anecdote, like, I was just like, we were talking about how we can make racial justice sort of more prominent. How do we get rid of white supremacy, these tenets of white supremacy in our workplace? And she was like, we go back to our ancestors. Like, we all worked collectively, we all, I mean, it's in our nature to work cooperatively. And, even like real policy things like everybody should know each other's wages. Then we know where the favoritism is happening. I'm like, these, like, folks have the answers. We're just asking the wrong people, maybe. So I'm just trying to listen and learn as much as I can so that we can imagine a world that's different.
Saru, any thoughts on not repeating mistakes?
Yeah, we haven't talked at all about a very live policy that's moving in Congress right now, which is the Raise the Wage Act, which would raise the minimum wage to 15 across the board and end the subminimum wage for tipped workers, workers with disabilities, and youth. And this really, to Reem's point, this is a result of workers organizing. Obviously, the Fight for 15 has been out there organizing workers, but so have tipped workers. When all of last year, we had tipped worker strikes, restaurant worker strikes all over the country, and two groups of people heard us. One is there were hundreds of small business restaurant owners around the country who actually changed their policies during the pandemic. We heard from lots of employers who had fought us in the past, who had funded the NRA's campaigns against us, and then decided to change their mind during the pandemic, pay a full livable wage, go through our equity programs. People had a real change of heart, in part because they saw workers stand up and organize, and some cases because they saw workers say, I'm not going to come back without livable wages or a different model. But the other folks that did hear us was the Biden-Harris campaign. They prioritized this issue. They made it part of the COVID bill. It got stripped out of the COVID bill. There are 8 senators, Democrats, who have voted against this. And the majority of them are saying it's because they're fine with raising the overall minimum wage. Let's just leave tipped workers behind. And it is because of the influence and power of the National Restaurant Association. And so we desperately need everybody's help to let senators know, to let Congress know, to let the president know that you're talking about sure restaurants open because there'll be workers that actually want to work in this industry. It's also important because our economy can't recover unless these folks can afford to consume. And right now, if they're stealing food for their children, that means they can't afford to consume anything. And so we have to make sure this is our top priority. If we don't, the economic inequality that existed prior to the pandemic, and in my opinion, led directly to the election of Donald Trump. Fascism rises when inequality grows. we have to make sure we don't allow this inequality to persist and grow. That's the only way forward. So we need everybody's help to pass the Raise the Wage Act in Congress.
That was incredibly eloquent and really, I think, a good spot to end. Final comment from a reader that I just really want to share, because I think we can all agree. The reader says, "Go Reem, go Tunde, go Saru, sending safety and wellness to you and your close ones, working alongside you always." So thank you so much, all of you. I just really appreciated all of your thoughts, and it was wonderful to come together during this conversation. So goodbye.
Thank you.
You've all been watching a special Mother Jones live event. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Maddie Oatman. You can rewatch the show online anywhere you're watching now. So that could be YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. And as always, please follow along with our groundbreaking reporting on how the politics of food shapes our everyday lives at motherjones.com. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.